No. Okay. So Psalm 49. Okay. I want to eventually end up at Uvalde, all right, or Uvalde, all right. That's the small town in Texas where the shoot up happened yesterday. 19, two adults, the rest children, were murdered by that 18-year-old. And then, a decade ago, Sandy Hook, where 24 were murdered in an elementary school. Um, and then, lest we forget, in 1999, I forget how many at Columbine, it was high school, but still, mass murders in schools. And this, more than anything else, grabs our attention and shows the evil that none of us want to admit is common. And we have to have an answer. I mean, one of the common things I keep hearing from the millennial Zoomer generation, Corey, Nolan, Stephen, Megan, that would be you guys, is if God is all powerful and he's all perfect, why doesn't he do something to stop this kind of stuff? It's a very real question. It's a very fair question. It's been around for a long time. The technical term for it is theodicy, all right? And it's the summary of that in popular language is the problem of evil. And the point is, how do you justify evil in the presence of a holy, powerful God? Why doesn't he do something about it? And I'm not going to try and answer all of that. There's a number of different things that answer that question satisfactorily. But I am going to go to the question we don't ask, which is this the exception to the rule? Or is this kind of normal for all of us? Is this kind of evil normal in the heart of all? We might not act on it, but is it there? And the Bible's answer to why is there such evil is one that, frankly, it will kill you before it will give you comfort. And then it kills you in order to give you new life. So it's the best medicine you're ever going to find. So I wanted to begin just briefly with Psalm 49. I have my personal worship there today. And this is David, and he's talking about, why should I fear in times of trouble when the iniquity, the sin and its repercussions of those who cheat me surrounds me, those who trust in their wealth and boast in the abundance of their riches. Truly no man can ransom another. What are we in the world? How do we get to ransom? Hold on a second. Now it's not scrolling. I just love it when the software doesn't do what you want it to do. Let's try again. Okay, I'm going to have to close that, and then we'll keep going. Hold on, guys. Truly no man can ransom another, meaning buy him out of some debt that he's in. Pretty bad debt if you call it a ransom, all right? Or give God the price of his life. In other words, he owes something to God. For the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice that he should live on forever and never see the pit. I mean, God's basically saying there's something wrong with us that's going to end up put us in the pit. That's an Old Testament way of describing that place of judgment. The New Testament gets called hell. Then it goes on, for God sees that even the wise die. The fool and the stupid alike must perish and leave their wealth to others. Everything that they've grabbed and accumulated in this world isn't going to do them any good. Their graves are their homes forever, their dwelling place to all generations. There they called lands by their own names. Many in his pomp will not remain. Man in his pomp, will not remain. He is like the beasts that perish. Chris might say it this way. There's no such thing as doggy heaven. And man without a relationship with God, we end up in the same place, in a place where there's only death. This is the path of those who have foolish confidence, yet after them people approve of their boasts. We still find it comforting to look on others, say, yeah. And so it's easy for us in our pursuit of quote unquote goodness, in our pursuit of our own sincerity, our own integrity. It's easy for us to say, well, I'm not like that guy. All right? And even the worst of us will say, I'm not that bad. But how does God see us? All right? Paul, trying to prove this in Romans 3, says this. What then are we Jews, and we might summarize it this way, we who were the first to be given the promise of a Messiah, are we any better off than the Gentiles, than everyone else? Unless there's someone with a Jewish background here, I think that is all of us. Okay? No Native American doesn't count, so you're with the rest of us. Sorry, dude. Right? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both those who are first in and those who are never in, Jews and Greeks, are under sin. Now, that's an interesting way of saying it. That language is talking about under the rule of sin. So what he's saying is you get up every morning and the driving principle that will control your life is sin. Now, we have a simple tool that we use in our church to summarize these things, and we ask this question of children: what is sin? And the answer, designed for a child, even though it's a little bit more complex for children today, sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. Or maybe we might modernize that and say, sin is any lack of obeying God's law or the breaking of God's law. So you have a positive obligation to do what God says. You have a negative obligation to not do what God says don't do. And that's pretty simple, all right? So, and he goes on, and when he says under sin, he's saying that all of us are under the rule, the reign, the dominion, the control. It drives our thinking, our desires, our feelings, our choices. Is that really what's going on? And then he quotes from the Old Testament. He just quotes a number of different verses. I'm just going to give you these and give you some comments. None is righteous, no, not one. Simple definition of the word righteous is in a right relationship with God. Only God is perfectly righteous by himself. He thinks and does only what is right. Perfectly morally right at all times. And we're not, when we talk about thinking what is right, we're not talking about in some sort of narrow way. This includes emotional rightness. He feels right about others. This includes conscience righteousness. He desires well for others. And this includes choices. Even the choices that we would look at and say, well, that doesn't look good. God only does what is right. Because in the inside, he only is right. Now, when we apply it to man, none is righteous, no, not one. What the Bible is saying is that a single one of us is born with an inherent rightness with God. Not a single one of us. And then he goes on to now apply this. No one understands God. So therefore, we might even try and look for God, but we're not going to really get it. But then he points out, and the reality is, when you examine how much we all say, well, I want to understand God, most of us, our interest in God just kind of wanes and disappears after a little bit of effort. He says, no one seeks for God. I mean, if you were told that there was in that green slime pond that Nolan has out there in the corner of the property, right? If you were told that there was a well underneath of that was going to produce billions of dollars for the next 50 years, and no one was going to give you 1%, okay? You might sit there and say, well, that's not that much. 1% a year is $1 million a year, okay? Come on, guys, let's get out there and dig this well, okay? You'd be out there. You'd be seeking it. You wouldn't give up until you got it, green slime or no, all right? Well, that's what he means here. We don't seek after God as if he's the most valuable thing we could ever have in our lives. Instead, all have turned aside. That language there is to be walking down a path that you think is going to lead you to the best life possible for all eternity. We would say in Christian terms, in the Bible's terms, to lead you to eternity. Perfect life with God for all eternity. We all turn aside. We step off the path. California, third year of their drought. Right? Is it any wonder they're having problems now with rattlesnakes? Their rattlesnake population is booming because rattlesnakes like it when it's hotter, and that's what's going on. The drought is hotter, right? We've turned off of the safe path onto where the rocks and the brush is, where there's more rattlesnakes. Together they have become worthless. He's describing our efforts to have our best lives now, to really pursue our dreams in this world. And he's echoing then what Psalm 49 says. Well, you're going to die and leave it for someone else. It's not going to do you any good. You're not going to take it with you. And even if you could, it wouldn't make you any better in God's eyes. He goes on to say, because no one does good, not even one. So he begins by saying, none of us is righteous. And he ends with, therefore, none of us does good. But, okay, in principle. But, you know, this guy down in Uvalde, I mean, he was exceptionally wicked. None of us are like that. Well, then you have to go to Jesus, who says the look at someone with sexual desire demonstrates that you have the same kind of heart. You are not guilty of doing what the person who commits adultery has done. You are guilty of having the same kind of being. And that's enough to send you to hell. He says about the guy who looks at his brother and loses his temper and cusses him out. And I know every single one of us has done that. And if not brother, then sister. If not sister, then father. And if not father, then mother. Or boss.
Didn't you even go further on that and say that you were guilty of, like,
if you are guilty of having a murderous heart? Yeah. What he says is that you're guilty enough to come before the judgment and be sent to hell. Later on in Matthew 16, he uses that language of what comes out of the mouth demonstrates what's in the heart. Okay? And there are degrees of sin. And so he's not saying anger, for example, expressed is the same as what that guy did. But what he is saying is they come from the same seed in our souls. Listen to what he says here, verse 13. Again, he's just quoting the Old Testament here. Their throat is an open grave. Okay, that what literally is, that's someone who digs a pit. I'm watching some made-for-TV series about some murders in Utah among the Mormons, and this one Indian detective. They don't like Indians for the most part. All right, he's on the case and he's walking through the woods. I'll tell you why later on. Okay, and you're the Lamanites, you're Lamites, you're in trouble. And these people have dug deadfall pits. You guys know what a deadfall pit is? It's a pit that if you fall into it, chances are you're going to die. All right? They're not bungee pits. That's worse. All right? Learned that from the Vietnamese in Vietnam. But these things are designed to kill people. He falls into one. He doesn't die, fortunately, but he did fall into one. This, when it says their throat is an open grave, he's saying when you open your mouth, what's going to come out of you is what's in your heart. And what's in your heart will bring forth death. They use their tongues to deceive. That's how it brings forth death. We're given over to following the prince of the power of the air, Ephesians says, otherwise called the father of lies, Satan, the first liar. He then goes on and characterizes it this way. In other words, the venom of asps is under their lips. They're like poisonous snakes whose fangs are hidden away until they yank that jaw back, open their mouth, and bite. Their mouth is full of curses and bitterness. It sounds like we've got a pretty bad heart. Okay? But still, we're not as bad as that guy who committed all those things down there in Uvalde. Verse 15. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery. And the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. You see, the law of God in its second use, and this is what Romans 13 and the civil authorities having the responsibility to apply God's law towards evildoers. All right? The law of God in its second use is intended to cause those of us, even when we don't know him, to fear punishment and to stop. Well, I'm going to cuss this guy out, but I'm not going to hit him. It stops you short of committing manslaughter. It stops you short. Well, I'm going to resent him, but I'm not going to plot his murder. It stops you short of going and buying a couple of rifles the day after you turn 18, and then going and trying to kill your grandmother, and then shooting up elementary school, killing 19 in one classroom. That's what this 18-year-old did. Does this make sense? Okay? And this is what he's describing. We may not have all done the sins that this young man did. So when he stands on the day of judgment, his judgment will be based on what he's done and what he is. And our judgment will be based on what we've done. And we might not experience as bad a judgment as hell as him, but because we have the same heart, we will be in that same place. Their way, there is no fear of God before their eyes. And that is really what it comes down to. We don't have fear of God. Now, how do we get fear of God? Well, it's really simple. That's one of the things Jesus came. He came to strike the fear of God. Literally, if you'll bear with me and let me say this way, He came to scare the hell out of us. Okay? He came to actually communicate in such a way that the Spirit would use it and change our hearts. Right now, all I'm doing is changing your ears. Okay? If you got some wax in there, okay, if you're like Brennan and I, you got some extra hair in there, okay, you look like you got hair. All right?
Cool.
A couple, all right. It ain't going to do, I'm going to tickle your ears and that's about it. Only the Holy Spirit can change our hearts. And what he does is he convicts us. He convicts us that what that young man did was evil. But then he convicts us when we look at some of the background. That poor young man was brutalized by bullying for the last 2 or 3 years. That poor young man was not raised by parents who cared for him and paid attention to him. That poor young man, you hear me saying this, poor young man, I'm not excusing anything he's done. I am observing that he's part of a family, part of a community, which sowed hatred into his soul. Am I saying they're responsible for the guns that he bought and used? No. But they are responsible for the bullying that they gave him, the evil with which they treated him. Because they're just like the rest of us. Our feet are swift to shed blood, and in our paths, in our daily lives, we're going to end up in ruin and misery because we don't know the way of peace. That word way there, the original phrase for Christianity was the way. It was a summary of what the Old Testament says, all right, about how to walk with God and end up like some of you remember the name Enoch, lived 365 years, and then he was not because God took him, right? Didn't die, all right? Basically a prefiguring, a pre-version of resurrection for the rest of us. He was a friend of God. You can imagine 365 years, that's plenty of time to be a friend of God, right? We have that opportunity now without having to live 365 years, thank goodness. Okay? I know Chris wants to live forever, so does Corey. Right? But not in this world, right? In a much better place. So as we look at this evil, we have to hear that nothing we're going to do in this world, what Psalm 49 was talking about, is going to do us any good on the day of judgment. We have to hear what Romans says, that but by the grace of God, any of us could find ourselves in that young man's situation. And we have to condemn with the strongest language possible that there is evil. And what that man did it. What that man did then, evil resides in our own hearts. That's the beginning of being put to death by Jesus and being brought to life in what he calls being born again. I know we've talked about that some, so I'm not going to go over it. If I can ever explain any of these, but normally what ends up happening, at some point you start to go, now, wait a minute. What you said about this started to make sense, but when I think about it over here, it sounds like it's contradicting something. And what ends up happening is we normally end up thinking about life from 2 different worldviews. How do I live? And 2 different meta-narratives. What's the story? There's the world's and Satan's, and then there's God's. And when they come into conflict, that's a good thing. Because then we can start asking questions of God and see him straighten them out. So there it is, guys. More evil perpetrated. You're going to hear all the ordinary stuff that's not going to solve anything. And yet the solution is Jesus. There is hope in him. Okay, let me pray. Lord, thank you so much for the attentiveness and the kindness these guys have shown me. Please bless them and bless their work here. Always keep them safe, God. No fingers in the bandsaw, God. No nails in the foot. And no forklifts going off the edge. Please, God. Protect them and watch over them. And then give them Jesus to convict them of their sin and to comfort them that they are saved in him. In his name we ask. Amen.